Have you ever been winning a game of Commander and you think to yourself, I'd really like to lose the game right now? Well, with this deck, you can. 25 different ways. All of these cards can make you lose the game, and we're playing all of them. However, we're going to use them to win the game. And since these cards appear in all 5 different colors, that means we need to be playing a 5-color commander. And the commander for this deck is Kenrith the Returned King. Now I have actually made a video about this deck before, however, since I made that video, the deck has undergone some significant changes, and also I've played it quite a lot more, so that means I can give you a much better insight on how the deck works. So why Kenrith as a commander? Well, he's kind of perfect actually. As I mentioned, we need a 5-color commander, and Kenrith is that. However, it only costs 4 and a white to cast, so it's actually pretty easy to cast. But the main thing is that, since we're playing all of these cards that say we lose the game, as well as many other cards which supplement this strategy, it means that there isn't really much room left in the deck for good cards. But fortunately, Kenrith has these 5 activated abilities, all of which are quite good. So we can be using these activated abilities in place of having actual cards in order to get us through the game and have our strategy actually work. And the most important of these activated abilities is probably one that you might not actually think would be at first glance. So now let's start looking at some lose conditions. There are 25 of them, and we're going to start off with this cycle right here. These are the Pacts. There is 1 for every color, and all of them are very similar. They're all instants, which cost 0 mana. However, you have to pay some amount of mana on your next upkeep, otherwise you lose the game. Pact of Negation and Summoner's Pact are probably the most popular ones because they see play outside of Commander, but they're also very popular Commander cards. And then Slaughter Pact is also just a good removal spell. Intervention Pact can be pretty useful actually, but then there's one card left here which is way worse than the rest of the cards in the cycle. That's the red one here in Pact of the Titan. In comparison to the rest of these cards, this card sucks. But anyway, it says we lose the game, so we're playing it. The next set of lose cons is this one right here. These are the extra turn cards. These are probably the best cards in the deck, and they are very powerful. With these cards in the deck, it can sometimes feel similar to playing an Obeka deck, and you could build it similar to that deck, but that isn't exactly what we've done here. But these cards say we lose the game, so we're playing them. All of them do more or less the same thing, but in a bit of a different way. So there's Warrior's Oath, Final Fortune, Glorious End, Last Chance, Chance for Glory, and Alchemist's Gambit. All of these give us an extra turn, except for Glorious End, I guess, which doesn't actually give us an extra turn. In a 1 versus 1 game, it kind of does, because what it says is it ends the turn, which means, you know, in 1 versus 1, you just go to your opponent's upkeep and you end the turn, which is basically giving you an extra turn. But in a 4-player game, it's not quite that, but it's still very similar. But with these cards, for as low as 2 mana, we can get an extra turn. However, we lose the game on the next end step, but we have some cards in the deck which can make that not happen. And we're going to get to those in a moment, but yes, these are very powerful cards. There's a set of lose cons here that are related to this very classic card called Lichs. There is Nefarious Lich, Lich's Mastery, and then just straight up Lich. So these are all enchantments, and if they leave the battlefield, then we lose the game. But they can be pretty powerful though. So Nefarious Lich says if you would be dealt damage, remove that many cards from your graveyard from the game instead. If you can't, you lose the game. If you would gain life, draw that many cards instead. And then when it leaves play, you lose the game. So it is a pretty powerful effect. However, it's difficult to get it to work in a way that doesn't actually make us lose the game. So probably the most useful thing to do with this card is to give it to an opponent. And we have some ways to do that as well. Lich's Mastery though, I think this is probably the best card in the deck. This card is very powerful. It's an enchantment, it's a legendary enchantment actually. It says it has hexproof, and you can't lose the game. Whenever you gain life, draw that many cards. Whenever you lose life, for each 1 life that you lost, exile a permanent you control, or a card from your hand, or from your graveyard. And then also, when it leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. So not only is this a lose con, it's also a card that says we can't lose, so it's pretty unique in that aspect. But as I said, this is probably the best card in the deck because it has that phrase, you can't lose the game. So that means with those extra turn cards, which say we lose the game, we can just play those, get an extra turn for 2 mana, and we don't lose. We just keep playing if we have this in play. But also, there's the part of this card that says whenever you gain life, draw that many cards. And there was that one activated ability that Kenrith has that happens to work pretty well with this. We can pay just 3 mana, gain 5 life, and if we have Lich's Mastery in play, that means we're also gonna draw 5 cards. So that makes the cost of having Lich's Mastery in play very easy to pay because, you know, we have to be losing cards from our hand or permanents or cards from our graveyard, but if we can just draw 5 cards by paying 3 mana, it's going to be pretty easy to pay that cost. And then there's the classic card here, Lich. This one is worded kind of strangely because it's an old card, but it does a similar thing. It's just a lot worse. We have 3 creatures here, which act as lose cons. They're pretty good though. The first one, Phage the Untouchable, is extremely good actually because this is one way we can win the game very easily. So Phage says, if it enters the battlefield and you didn't cast it from your hand, you lose the game. It also has these other abilities which can be relevant, but that first one is mainly what we're playing it for, because what we want to do with Phage is have it in play. Usually we'll just cast it, but we could also reanimate it with Kenrith, and if we have something like, say, Lich's Mastery in play, we're not going to lose the game. But you can use this card right here, Fractured Identity. If you cast this on a Phage, you just win, because you destroy your Phage, and then each other player gets a copy of Phage, and they didn't cast those copies, which means they lose. Then there's also Enduring Angel here, which is a cool one because it's another one of these cards which acts as a lose con, but also a way to prevent us from losing, at least momentarily. And there's also Archfiend of the Drawseer, which is actually a pretty popular one. This saw play in Standard. I think it still does a little bit, but it's a 6/6 flying for just 4 mana and enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from it. Then if it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. Also, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. So with this one, this is another one where it's a great card to give to our opponents. And we have several ways to do that, whether it's through a card like Donate or Harmless Offering or something like that. But basically, we can have this in play, wait until it only has 1 oil counter left on it, and then just give it to the opponent. They'll have it when the last oil counter is removed, and they will lose the game. We have a set of lose cons here, which are enchantments, and they're all pretty unique. The only thing that really makes these related is that they're enchantments, but we have Forbidden Crypt here. So this one says, for each card you would draw, instead choose a card in your graveyard and put it into your hand. If you can't, you lose the game. Whenever a card is put into your graveyard, remove that card from the game. So this is some really good, graveyard recursion, but this is probably one of the worst lose cons in the deck. I've found that this card, usually it does nothing. This is another good one though, which can be a good card to donate to our opponent. So that's kind of the cool thing with this deck, is that some of these cards aren't really that good. They can make us lose very easily, but if that's the case, then we just give that card to our opponent instead, because we have many ways to do that. There's a similar card here, Out of the Tombs, a much better one though, I think. So this is a newer one from the Warhammer decks. It says, at the beginning of your upkeep, put 2 Eon counters on it, then mill cards equal to the number of Eon counters on it. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, instead return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you can't, you lose the game. So I found with this card through playing it is that I've actually never got to return a creature using its ability, I think, but it's pretty good just as a source of self-mill. Because with Kenrith, one of his abilities is that you can just reanimate a creature from your graveyard. So if you have this self-mill engine in play, it works quite well with that. But then also, this is a card that can really feed something like Lich's Mastery, where you want a bunch of cards in your graveyard to make sure that you're not going to lose the game. Next is this card right here, which is quite unique. This is Transcendence. It says you don't lose the game for having 0 or less life. When you have 20 or more life, you lose the game. Whenever you lose life, you gain 2 life for each 1 life you lost. So this is a weird one for Commander because you start with 40 life. So if you play this card, you usually just lose. Like some of the other cards though, that can be good because this is a great one to give to your opponent. But also, this can work well with cards like Lich's Mastery and other cards that say we can't lose the game. So as you can see, a lot of our lose cons here, which are not very good, are actually quite good win cons if we give them to the opponent. Next is Triskaidekaphobia. This one is quite the meme card. It's pretty hard to get this card to work, but if it ever does, it'll feel awesome. But it says at the beginning of your upkeep, choose one. Each player with exactly 13 life loses the game, then each player gains a life, or each player with exactly 13 life loses the game, then each player loses a life. It's pretty difficult to have someone at exactly 13 life, unless you're playing this card right here, Tree of Perdition. So this card combos pretty great with Triskaidekaphobia, seeing as it has 13 toughness, and you can exchange its toughness with a player's life total. So if you want to take out one opponent right away, you can just use Tree of Perdition to give them 13 life and have them lose to Triskaidekaphobia. And then there's Demonic Pact here. This one is actually very good. So it says at the beginning of your upkeep, choose one that hasn't been chosen. It does 4 damage to a creature or player, and you gain 4 life. I imagine that's probably being errated to any target. Target opponent discards 2 cards, you draw 2 cards, or you lose the game. This has some very powerful effects, so you can just play this for 4 mana. You can get, the 3 abilities which don't say you lose the game, and then once there's only the last choice left, then you give it to your opponent and you make them lose. We've also got a few artifacts here which can make us lose the game. These are all fairly unique as well. So there's this one, Immortal Coil. It says you can tap it and remove 2 cards from your graveyard from the game to draw a card. If damage would be dealt to you, prevent that damage. Remove a card in your graveyard from the game for each 1 damage prevented this way. When there are no cards in your graveyard, you lose the game. So this one is also one that's kind of hard to get going. This can be a good one to donate to your opponents as well, because you can just give this to your opponent, and then if you can somehow get rid of their graveyard, or if they just have no graveyard, then they just straight up lose right away. We've also got the Deck of Many Things. So this one, it does a lot. So you pay 2 and tap it, and you roll a d20, then subtract the number of cards in your hand. If the result is 0 or less, discard your hand. So if you roll 1 through 9, you return a card at random from your graveyard to your hand. If you roll 10 through 19, you draw 2 cards. And if you roll a 20, you put a creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. When that creature dies, its owner loses the game. So this one, it can make us lose the game if we choose one of our creatures. But this can also be a win condition, because, we could take one of our opponent's creatures, have it die, and they would lose the game. But usually you're not going to roll a 20, but this has, a pretty powerful effect. Being able to draw 2 for basically 2 mana is pretty sweet. You could get unlucky and discard your hand, but that's what makes this card fun. And then lastly here we have Door to Nothingness. This isn't necessarily a lose con like the other cards where it actually has the words you lose the game, but it says target player loses a game, so we could just target ourselves and make us lose the game. So that's good enough for me. I think that counts. And if I'm playing a 5-color deck where the theme is lose conditions, I'm not going to not play Door to Nothingness. I think this card is awesome, and I love playing it, and I have used it before, and it feels great. So those are the lose conditions. There's a couple of cards here I'll point out that can help make those work. So I mentioned Fractured Identity already. That card is awesome with Phage the Untouchable. There's a kind of similar thing here going on with Hive Mind. So this is an enchantment that says, whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery, each other player copies that spell. Each of those players might choose new targets for his or her copy. So what you can do with this is just have this in play and play one of the Pacts. And any opponent who isn't able to pay the mana cost for the Pact, maybe they're just not in that color, they're just going to lose because they have to cast the copy, and the card says you lose the game if you don't pay that mana cost. There's this other one that is a very recent addition to the deck, actually. This is Release to the Wind. And for cards like those Lichs or anything that says that you lose the game when it leaves play, this works really well with that, actually, because you can donate those cards to your opponent, they'll have it in play, and then you can use Release to the Wind to exile a non-land permanent, and it says for as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may cast it without paying its mana cost. So say your opponent has your Lich in play, you exile it, they'll lose the game, but then you can still just recast the card without paying its mana cost, and you can reuse it. You can cast it, donate it to someone else, and then make someone else lose. The next set of cards we're going to look at are ones that stop us from losing the game. So not only is the deck themed around lose conditions, it's also, I guess, themed around not lose conditions. But we have Platinum Angel right here. This is kind of the classic and big one. It says you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. So if we have something like this in play, whenever we cast one of those extra turn cards, or if we have something in play that says we lose the game, we don't lose the game. And there are several other cards in the deck which have a similar effect. For example, this one right here, the Golden Throne. This one says if you would lose the game, instead exile the Golden Throne and your life total becomes 1. But also you can tap this and sacrifice a creature to add 3 mana and any combination of colors. So that's actually a really good mana rock as well. There's Exquisite Archangel. It says if you would lose the game, instead exile Exquisite Archangel and your life total becomes equal to your starting life total. We have the Book of Exalted Deeds. The cool thing you want to do with this is that you can pair it with a card like Mutavault. So we have Mutavault in the deck as well, which is conveniently every creature type. So what you can do is activate your Mutavault, then use the Book of Exalted Deeds to put an Enlightened counter on the Mutavault, and then just let your Mutavault become a land again. And now you have a land that says you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. There's also a Gideon of the Trials. This is one that I find myself using very frequently, probably because it only costs 3 mana, but you can use its 0 ability to get an emblem that says as long as you control a Gideon Planeswalker, you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. So what I do with this frequently is that I can just play this, use its 0 ability to get that emblem, and then start using the extra turn cards to really get going. And that's a very, very frequent play pattern that I find myself falling into. We've also got a Stunning Reversal as well. It says the next time you would lose the game this turn, instead draw 7 cards and your life total becomes 1. Exile Stunning Reversal. There's a 9 lives here. This one, it doesn't necessarily stop us from losing the game, but it seems so thematically similar that it feels like it should be in this deck. This could also be a good one to donate to opponents because, you know, it has that text that says when it leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. There's a Cloudsteel Kieran here. This is one that I have used pretty frequently, so it's just a 3/2 flyer for 3, but it has the reconfigure ability. So it says equipped creature has flying and you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game, and you can equip it to a creature for 5 mana. So basically, it's very similar to a Platinum Angel. And there's also Angel's Grace here, just 1 mana, instant with Split Second. It says you can't lose the game this turn and your opponents can't win the game this turn. Until end of turn, damage that reduces your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. So once again, this can be a way to get going very quickly with those extra turn cards. And to go along with these cards that stop us from losing the game, I want to point out this card right here, Abyssal Persecutor. I want to point it out because it's hilarious. I mentioned this in my previous video, but it's still just as funny, I think, because if you pair this with something like Platinum Angel, it means the game can't end. I mean, players can concede whenever they want, but the game just can't end otherwise. Because Abyssal Persecutor says you can't win the game and your opponents can't lose the game, and Platinum Angel says you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. So, you know, the game just can't end. So with a lot of the lose condition cards, I kept mentioning ways to donate them to our opponents. So we have a section of cards here which can do that. Cards like this one right here, donate. It's very simple. It's just 3 mana sorcery. It says target player gains control of target permanent you control. So this is a simple way to give our opponents something which, you know, can make them lose. It's the same idea with Harmless Offering right here, and with Zedru the Greathearted. I mentioned we can also do this with Fractured Identity. And then there's this card right here, Sudden Substitution, which does a pretty similar thing. This one has Split Second, it's an instant, and it says exchange control of target non-creature spell and target creature. Then the spell's controller may choose new targets for it. So this can work well with the Pacts. We can basically donate a Pact to our opponent, and if they can't pay the mana cost for the Pact, then they'll lose. Now, outside of the weird lose the game strategy cards and cards that supplement those kinds of things, we do also have a few just good staple cards in the deck. There aren't that many, because as I mentioned, there isn't a whole lot of room for them, but we've got a few in here. So we have Teferi's Protection. It's just, you know, great protection. We have Anguished Unmaking. This is removal for almost anything. This can also work well with the lose cons though, because, you know, if we give our opponents one of them that makes them lose when it leaves play, we can exile it with this. We have 2 tutors here in Demonic Tutor and Vampiric Tutor. There's also Eternal Witness. This is actually really good with Kenrith because we can use this to rebuy something. Then if Eternal Witness dies, we can reanimate it with Kenrith and use its ability once again. Also, this is a target for Summoner's Pact. And then just as some more added protection, we also have a Heroic Intervention right here. Next we have quite a bit of ramp because the deck can tend to be a bit slow starting off. You know, Kenrith costs 5 mana and we're doing some kind of dirtily stuff, so we do need quite a bit of ramp. So we have some artifact ramp here in Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, Chromatic Lantern. Chromatic Lantern is a big one because the color restrictions on the card we're playing is all over the place, so Chromatic Lantern is very useful. And then I have a Mana Vault here instead of a Mana Crypt because it's just slightly less degenerate than Mana Crypt. We have some classic land ramp here in Farseek, Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, and Sky Shroud Claim. And then some creature ramp in the form of Birds of Paradise, Succor a Tribe Elder, Bloom Tender, and Dockside Extortionist. And lastly, we have the lands. Since it's a 5-color deck that's really dependent on having all of the colors, we don't have a whole lot of room for utility lands. There are a couple in here, so we have Reliquary Tower. We've also got the World Tree here. I count this as a utility land because it has the kind of the same ability as Chromatic Lantern. There's also a Boseiju who endures, and on Otawara, Soaring City. You know, this is kind of just a way to fit an extra kind of spell in the deck, because as I mentioned, there isn't really a whole lot of room for good spells in the deck, but this is putting them in the mana base instead. We've got the Mutavault here that I mentioned works well with the Book of Exalted Deeds. And then we also have a Plaza of Heroes. For the rest of the mana base though, we're using some what I call rainbow lands because they tap for any color, or at least any color that we need. So we have things like Forbidden Orchard, Mana Confluence, City of Brass, Exotic Orchard, Command Tower, all that good stuff. We've also got many of the fetch lands and shock lands here. We're playing a good number of Triomes too. I'm not going to name off everyone, but you can see them here, and also you can find them in the deck list that I'll link. And then for basic lands, we only have 3 basic lands. I've chosen Plains, Island, and Forest. I like having access to usually at least 1 basic land of each color that we're playing, but in this case I feel like there just isn't enough room to play 5 basic lands, but we have 3 of them here anyway. And that is the deck. I've played this deck quite a lot, and this is one of my favorite decks that I own. I have many commander decks, and usually when I go out to an event or something, I'll pick 2 of them to bring with me, and I find that a lot of the time this is one of the 2 that I bring. It's very cool to play a deck like this, which is kind of breaking the game in a lot of ways. And there's so much cool stuff you can do when you have abilities that say you lose the game and also you can't lose the game. If you have suggestions for the deck, I'd definitely be happy to read them in the comments below. I learned a lot about this deck from the comments in the previous video that I made about it, and I've used a lot of those suggestions to make changes to this deck, and I feel like the deck is a lot better now. But if you're still watching though, thanks for watching. It'd be cool if you can like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. I definitely encourage everyone to come join my Discord server. You can find a link to that in the video description. We have a deck brewing channel, which helped a lot with coming up with this deck initially when I made the first video. Also, if you're looking to purchase any gaming supplies like playmats or custom tokens, you can get those by going to the Snug and Dave store, which is my store. You can find that linked in the video description below as well. And if you're looking to buy any Magic cards, you can get those from MTG North. They're a supporter of the channel, and they also have their own YouTube channel, which is quite funny. And also, I'd just like to take a moment to thank all the patrons that support me on Patreon. But otherwise though, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.